and welcome to our 21st episode of Join Us at the Table. I'm Morgan.
And I'm Anna, and today we're excited to have Raj Patel with us.
Raj is an award-winning author, filmmaker, and academic, and is currently a research professor at the University of Texas, Austin. He has been an advocate for food systems and has testified about the causes of the global food crisis, in addition to being a member of the International Panel of Experts on Sustainable Food Systems, which works to address the threat of the collapse of sustainable food systems. Raj has written several books, including Stuffed and Starved, The Value of Nothing, and Inflamed, and has also directed the film The Ants and the Grasshopper. Thank you so much for joining us today, Raj.
Excited to have you here. So welcome. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself and what inspired you to make the Ants and the Grasshopper documentary?
Thank you so much. I mean, yes, Morgan very generously has already introduced me in terms of the work and all that. But for the Ants and the Grasshopper, the reason I made it is because I was fed up of seeing the kinds of documentary film that presented the suffering of communities, of people of color, of frontline communities, of working class people, as a reason to look into something, but never trusted those communities enough to be able to give them a microphone and to let them narrate the world from their perspective and to present their deep and profound understandings and solutions to the problems that they face. So that was the reason for the Ants and the Grasshopper, rather than me being a talking head, sort of doing a David Attenborough sort of thing of like, and here we are among the poor. It was much more about me shutting up and getting out of the way. And our main protagonist, a woman called Anita Chitaya, who is a farmer in a small village in northern Malawi. And she's part of an organization called Soils, Food and Healthy Communities. So what she does is take us through her work, her life, and then on a journey to the United States to school us. So, if you imagine coming to America, God forbid that you've seen the film, but, this is a story about someone from Africa coming to the United States and not being sort of bamboozled, the bumpkin in the brave new world, but much more the person who's appalled with how badly we treat one another and how badly we are caring for the planet on which we live. And that's a very different sort of model and mode of understanding than I think we normally see when it comes to food documentaries, which in the United States tend to be painfully parochial.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing. I think I can speak on behalf of all of us in saying that we thoroughly enjoyed your documentary. And you did kind of start to touch on this already, but I was hoping you could speak more upon, the impact that the creation of the documentary had specifically on the Malawi woman and on their village. And then kind of a second part of this question would be, how did making the documentary impact your life as a whole as well?
I mean, in terms of the day-to-day business of things happening in Malawi, there were a couple of sites in the United States where women from Malawi came over and learned some interesting things and interesting ways of planting and techniques for things like rainwater harvesting. And all of that was something that we're very excited about, but it takes money to be able to implement all that. So people came back from Malawi with wisdom, but not necessarily with cash. And although we were able in the end, as a documentary film team, to pay for the music in the film, we paid a commercial rate for the songs that you hear from time to time in the film, which were scored and sometimes, composed and always sung by people in community. The amount that we were able to pay ended up being $500 per person, which in a year when there was no income coming from abroad because of COVID was very well received. But in the end, that's not enough to be able to put in a rainwater harvesting system and feed everyone who sang in the documentary and do everything else. So, in terms of does being in a documentary change your life? For most people in the village, not really. And for Anita, it has meant that she's been participating in certain kinds of discussions, but under lockdown, it's not as if Anita and Esther and anyone else from Malawi could actually go anywhere. It's only now 2 years after we finished, filming the last of the film, 1 year after the film was released, that we're starting to contemplate perhaps, folk from Malawi going elsewhere, because until recently, it's just not been possible. And for me, the journey was very much one of realizing my own power, unacknowledged behind the camera, because I sort of went into this filled with the activist rage, which I still have. And generally it's not a bad thing to walk around with, but just being pissed off at those guys and thinking, well, therefore I'm okay, because what I'm doing is better than the sort of idiocy that's on the screen and passes for decent food documentary. At least I'm not as bad as Food Inc. So it took a while for me to see, and it was really in dialogue with Anita and with the folk there, to realize I'm not, this isn't my space. I mean, I have a story to tell, but really what I need to do is take a step back. And that sort of process of checking myself, of recognizing my patriarchy and recognizing my colonial privilege, and recognizing the sort of privilege I have of having the resources that I do, despite whatever politics I have. In fact, having these politics perhaps made it a little easier, but also might have convinced me that I was so self-righteous and so righteous that I never bothered to sort of analyze where I was coming from. But over the 10 years of filming this, I recognized how I might be part of the problem and backed away, so that the eventual film has me in it a couple of times, because you have to acknowledge that you're actually making this thing. There's no sort of view from nowhere. I'm certainly, I crop up from time to time in the film, but mainly it's Anita's voice. And we spent a lot of time workshopping how it is that Anita wanted the film to look, and how she would be represented in the kinds of material that was in there. And in the end, this is a very different kind of film from the one I anticipated making 10 years ago, but it's much better because of that.
Wow, thank you so much for sharing that. It's really great to hear how it has impacted not only you, but also people in Malawi. So it's clearly evident that your experience with and involvement in food systems extends far beyond the documentary that you created. So for the students who aren't aware that may be watching this, what are some of the biggest issues and challenges that our food systems currently face?
Where to begin? Mainly, it's that we're living on a planet that we are killing. We're recording this a day after the International Panel on Climate Change released a report observing that things are much worse than we thought, and in some ways the damage from climate change is irreversible. The question now is, how bad is it going to be? It's already worse than we anticipated, and we are we just need to embrace and recognize that the food system is both a victim of climate change, right? The crops are being washed away, droughts and floods are leading to transformations in the way that we can expect food to happen. But also climate change is driven by some of the worst practices in the industrial food system, particularly around livestock. But the industrial food system is also contributing to deforestation, to the methane through industrial animal production, and all of this is driving climate change in some fairly serious ways. So climate change is a very big problem, but there are also basically there are 4 C's if you don't if you want to remember. There's climate change, there's conflict, because wherever there is war, there is hunger. And with the spread of conflict, we're recording on day 6 of the Ukrainian war, but the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But there's conflict in lots of places in the world, which has been ongoing, and which has already unleashed a vast toll of human suffering, but tends to get less play in the media here in the United States. But conflict is obviously a driver of hunger. So is COVID. Globally, COVID meant that the incomes dropped for the poorest people, and it's important to remember that hunger is caused not by an absence of food, but by an absence of money. So there's more than enough food right now still to be able to feed the world, but it's not distributed evenly because money is not distributed evenly. With COVID, the number of people who are able to afford food plummeted, and so the number of people who are food insecure hit 2 billion, in excess of 2 billion people around the world. And the last thing that's driving hunger and that's a problem in the food system is capitalism itself. The fourth C of climate change, conflict, COVID, and capitalism is the fourth, is perhaps the worst and most pernicious, because the modern food system has been crafted through centuries of colonialism and through the exploitation, the enslavement of people, the destruction of the natural world. That process means that now in the United States, 7 out of 10 of the worst paying jobs in America are in the food system. The people who got COVID, we were in the front lines of COVID earlier on, were precisely frontline workers in the food system, whether it was in meat processing or in grocery stores or wherever it is, delivery. All of this were, the essential workers who were outside the medical field were predominantly in the food system, and that meant that they were primarily exposed to COVID in ways that other people weren't. What happens in the United States is a sort of microcosm of what's happening elsewhere in the world, and poverty is driven by transformations in the food system, and the food system depends on the exploitation of peasants, of the landless, of the poor around the world. And that's a problem if you care about a sustainable food system, because we're very far from having a globally sustainable food system. We've got some local ones. They've taken a knocking under COVID. Some have flourished because local food supply chains have been more robust than international ones. But in general, we live in a world where the food system is exploiting the poorest, is not distributing food on the basis of the ability, of need. But it was never set up that way. And so what we need to do is rethink how it is that we do have a food system and make sure that nobody goes hungry, rather than one in which right now more than 2 billion people are food insecure.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, for sharing that. And I think, the 4 Cs that you just mentioned point to how interconnected everything is, especially, today in this day and age. And moreover, how clearly in need we are of a much more robust global food system. I absolutely agree with everything you said. Perhaps on a slightly lighter note, we were curious to hear, what advice you have specifically for students like ourselves that are looking to make food systems more sustainable and more equitable as well.
Good Lord. I mean, it's hard because the deep reasons for the lack of justice in the food system are very big problems. And it may feel incredibly frustrating that you can't immediately take on the exploitation of all workers and the history of colonialism. But you can do some of that. I mean, there is likely near you several workers who are being exploited by the contracts that they're under, either with your university or with Cisco or whatever food service provider there is. Moving away from that kind of model is terrific. There are moves afoot, at state level, in California, for instance, to try and make some of that happen. Lending your voice to that process would be a terrific idea. Certainly pressuring university administrations to do right by workers on campus, the women and men who are producing food, the communities that are dependent on the university for income, but where the university is paying bottom dollar. These are things that you can take a position on to be able to alleviate food insecurity in and around the university campus. It's also the case that students go hungry, and this is something that just distresses me no end, where students are like, of course, skipping a meal once or twice a week is normal, because that's just part of the grind of racking up student debt, and maybe you have to skip a few meals in order to be able to make pay the bills at the end of the week, and maybe even go out once in a while. And that just angers me, because that's not normal. I mean, certainly for me, growing up in Britain, where university education was free and they gave you money for food and for drink and for books, and where, you know, particularly, I mean, for working class students, there were lots of ways to be able to cushion the blows of you know, the demands on income. In the United States, to see so much student debt and to see so much student poverty and so much food insecurity is heartbreaking. And I'm so, you know, I mean, I'm pleased that there's recognition coming from students that this is a problem. I would like some of that to be translated into the university administration, because, you know, again, administrators seem to shrug their shoulders and say, well, you know, again, it's part of what it is to be a student here, that you have to work hard and occasionally you skip a meal or two. That to me is not just a violation of the right to food, which is a thing. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights has in it the right to food. Not that the United States has signed that, but it is normal not to want for food in a country as rich as this. And I don't think being a student should exempt you from that basic right. So insofar as you're you're able to agitate and organize, that's what you should do. So while, you know, the opportunities to change the world by shopping may not be at your disposal, don't worry about that. I mean, changing the world by shopping has never been successful. The only way that you can really change the world is by organizing. And now's a good time to get used to doing that.
Wow, thank you so much. That's definitely a lot of great insights for students, and not only for students, but about students, and that a lot of people can take into consideration. So clearly you have this insight of students. I mean, you're working at a university, so it makes sense. And throughout your various careers, you have consistently worked to address the injustices within food systems and the global crisis. So to pivot a little bit, in 2014, you taught an edible education class at Berkeley with Michael Pollan. So I was hoping you could tell us more about how this class was structured and what students were able to gain from it.
Just to share a little bit about the edible education class, I mean, what we were doing was, I mean, it started because of a move by the tremendous chef and restaurateur Alice Waters. And she was keen for students at Berkeley to be able to be exposed to ideas about the food system. I mean, so there were in lots of different pockets of Berkeley ideas about, you know, how agroecology could be an important part of farming systems, and people were interested in you know, the sort of anthropology of consumption. And what she wanted to do was really sort of bring everyone together around the table and recognize that we had you know, a lot in common, and that we could politically forge some very interesting coalitions. And so the edible education class was something that was a sort of 101 class, you know, big, 600, 700, 800 students sometimes would come, and we would you know, host speakers from around the world. And essentially it was a sort of conversation. You know, it was people would come and present their books or their ideas or whatever it was, but then you know, Michael and I would have conversations with them about some, you know, I mean, different topics around race, around, you know, genetically modified crops, you know, around a range of things that we were able to you know, basically introduce students to the hot topics in the food system. And you know, I mean, it's definitely a sort of creature of its time, because the whole idea of food studies was just flourishing and really coming out and really becoming an important site of student interest at that time. Now, you know, it's in a new iteration, and it's become a sort of innovation class, and that's you know, where Berkeley is heading, and that's what it needs to be for now. But in general, the idea that you could actually have a sort of tour of an entire university's offerings, from, you know, biochemistry to soil biology to nutrition to geography to, you know, sociology and history, and all, you know, pour it, and economics, and pour it all together and have it all in one place, was one of the great delights of teaching that class. And it was, you know, it was a way of breaking down the silos that the university has created, and instead creating a very welcoming table for students hungry for change.
So yeah, those are all just really good things to keep in mind. And I appreciate you kind of detailing what that class entailed. Again, segueing slightly, I would just really appreciate if you could expand further on, the dichotomy that exists between those people physically doing the farming and working within the agricultural sector and those larger corporations that are actually profiting from an economic standpoint. And moreover, how the globalization of crops has kind of become harmful to sustainable economies, and just what your perspective on that is. I know it's kind of a loaded question, but anything you have is appreciated.
Well, I mean, one of the ways that students are encouraged to make their way through student life is by taking a job in the service sector. And if you are if you're waiting tables, then you may know that the federal minimum tip wage is $2.18 an hour, $2.14 an hour, and the reason it's that low is because the National Restaurant Association has been fighting very hard in Congress for decades to keep it that low. While California has some terrific, amendments to that raise that wage, it still boggles the imagination that some people think that in the United States today you can live on that plus tips, and somehow that you can make any sort of dignified living that way. And that's emblematic of some of the ways that corporations do exploit workers, whether it's there's long been chambers of commerce and grocery manufacturers association, a range of other institutions that are very excited about keeping wages low. And the stories about when you join Walmart, you're also encouraged to sign up for SNAP and for other federal benefits, because Walmart knows full well that they don't pay you enough to be able to actually live on. These are just sort of old stories, but insofar as these corporations are global, they're able to pit workers in the United States against workers elsewhere in the world, and farmers in the United States against farmers elsewhere in the world. And because of the sort of global span of the commodity system, the wheat that is grown in the Midwest is genetically quite similar to the wheat that's grown elsewhere, so that it can be traded as a fungible commodity. So it's the idea is that actually you shouldn't be able to have any sort of locality to the wheat. The wheat that you grow as a commodity really does need to be basically the same no matter where in the world you grow it, so that commodity traders know that they're shifting the same stuff and trading the same stuff, and not some sort of exotic artisanal wheat, but instead bog standard sort of hard wheat number 2, whatever it is. And so that the sort of globalization of markets means that farmers are competing against each other, that the corporations win by having lower prices as this competition happens, and that consumers are nominally told, well, yes, of course you're getting a better deal because we, the corporation, pass on these savings to you, the consumer. But there's particularly with the food price inflation at the moment, little evidence that when prices fall, on the input side for corporations, corporations are doing anything other than profiteer. Prices should rise. So food corporation profits are up, and of course that means food price inflation for the poorest Americans, for the poorest people around the world. And this seems to be yet another example of the way in which by breaking the possibility of unionizing in the food system, by pitting workers and farmers and a range of other folk against each other, not just within the United States, but globally, by breaking the union movement and by breaking the possibilities of solidarity, these corporations are able to turn inflation into a huge profit increase for them, and a huge burden for the poorest families, not just in America, but worldwide. So, I mean, that's just an example of how it is that corporate power, through internationalizing and through breaking the union movement in the United States, has prospered. But it's also an incitement, I think, for us as we come to the end of our conversation to remember that actually there have been moments in American history where people got together and unionized and fought back. Now it would seem would be a good time to start learning some of those historical lessons from the United States labor history movement, so that we can start implementing them once again.
Absolutely. I think, again, I just wholeheartedly agree with what you've said. And I think that's definitely things that us as students, as well as just more broadly at this university institution, we can keep in mind. especially with so many things just unfolding in the world currently. This is all extremely relevant. So thank you. Yeah, that being said, we have so thoroughly enjoyed our chat with you today, and we are extremely appreciative of all of the insight you've shared. It's been such a pleasure getting to pick your brain. You can find more information about Raj Patel on his website, rajpatel.org. And also, if you're interested in watching his documentary, The Ants and the Grasshopper, it is now available through Santa Clara University's library.
Yeah, so we hope you've enjoyed today's session of Join Us at the Table. We'll post the link to the website and social media platforms at the end of this session. And if you'd like to view more episodes of Join Us at the Table, we'll also post the link to our CFIU website. Thank you so much.